Good morning. My name is Roland McReynolds. I'm Executive Director with the Carolina Farm Stewardship Association. And thank you for attending CFSA's 36th Annual Sustainable Agriculture Conference. You have joined the session Land Use, Farm Transfers, and Asset Protection, presented by Annette Hiatt of the Land Loss Prevention Project, Jamey Lowdermilk from the law firm of Brooks, Pierce, McClendon, Humphrey, and Leonard, and Andrew Branan, Extension Assistant Professor at NC State University. Together, these three attorneys have decades of experience providing legal assistance and supporting sustainable farmers, and we are pleased to have them joining us for this session here today. Feel free to use the chat feature to introduce yourself to your fellow attendees and our panelists, and to submit any questions that you have for our speakers throughout the workshop. Please remember our conference community agreements and keep them in mind when you engage in the chat or participate in group sessions. And I want to give a special thank you to our session sponsor here today, the Land Loss Prevention Project. You can check them out under the sponsors page of the website and the app, or visit them at the trade show for more information about their services. So now I'm going to hand it over to Jamey Lowdermilk for her to get us going.
All right, thanks so much, Roland, and thanks everyone for joining us. As you said, we're going to talk about land use, farm transfers, and asset protection. What we'd like to do today is take you through an overview of what we think are key concepts, legal concepts in each of these areas. Then we'll take some time for questions, and time permitting, we have a couple of scenarios that we've seen come up a couple times. We're going to talk through the things that folks are going to want to think about if they are in those situations. So I'm going to turn it over first to Andrew Branan to get us going.
Hey, everybody. My name is Andrew Branan. I'm an assistant extension professor over at Department of Agriculture and Resource Economics at NC State. And I'm sort of the extension person dealing with a lot of the farm law issues and natural resource environmental law issues for cooperative extension. So my portion of this, I'm going to talk about just some general land use concepts to be familiar with. Whether you've been farming, if you've been in farming for a while, you are probably familiar with these, but there's always more information to learn about them. Each of these topics, I've written various articles and fact sheets and such on my farm law portal, which just Google farm law NCSU and you'll find it. So the first one I have up here is property taxes. And our system of property taxation in North Carolina offers a differential assessment to qualifying farmland and forest land and horticulture land, so defined. In every county in North Carolina, all counties are required to appraise land that is in farm use or forest use at what we call use value. Normally, land is taxed at a certain percentage on $100 per highest and best use value. So if your land's worth $300,000, divide that by 100, and then apply a tax rate, and then that's what you pay. But if your land qualifies, you can enroll it in the PUV program, and through various formula, the county will appraise it at maybe say $100,000, and so the tax rate's applied, and then you're paying a lot less tax. The reason we're talking about this program is that it's critical when you're purchasing land to make sure that when you contract with a farmland owner, if the land is in present use value currently, that you're careful to make sure that it stays in present use value. And one of those things is when you're contracting with someone to purchase land, just make sure that there's a requirement that if the land doesn't qualify and the county finds out, that the seller is going to be paying for that, because that's the seller's fault. It's not going to be your fault. But if you buy land that for some reason the county decides is not qualified and they kick you out, what happens is that there's a 3-year rollback of taxes that the seller should have been paying in the difference between the highest use and the use value appraisals. And so that will show up on your tax bill and be a lien on your land. And so you want to make sure that that's taken care of. But again, it's a fascinating program. It sometimes scares the heck out of me because it's easy for some landowners to become disqualified without knowing and then have that financial penalty. The second concept here, bona fide farm. Those of y'all well in farming have probably heard this. This term is, in my view, exclusive to the concept of zoning. And what it describes is North Carolina's relatively new approach to exempting agriculture and forestry from county land use zoning. Not all counties have zoning, but more and more, and particularly the peri-urban counties, around the metro areas are doing that. Like Chatham County just zoned 366 square miles of its western portion within the last 5 years. And so what happens is any business in that area, if it doesn't qualify, if it's not a residence, it's a non-conforming use. For a bona fide farm, you can continue to farm no matter what the zoning designation becomes. Where this becomes critical, and it really it's come up mostly in the agritourism context. If you're inviting people to your farm and you're doing things like upfitting a barn with better wiring, or maybe even bathroom facilities, things like that, you're going to have to get building permits. And sometimes, and this still happens, the county permit people might push back and say, hey, you're using this for something that's other than farming. Well, what the General Assembly has done is made several key qualifiers, objective qualifiers, and there are 4 of them. One, if you have a farmer's tax exemption certificate from the Department of Revenue, it's a challenge for a new farmer to get one of those. You need to be farming for a little while and making $10,000 gross a year. But once you have that in your hand, you don't have to pay sales tax on inputs that you buy. The other one is your land qualifies for present use value, which I just explained. The other one is you have a forestry plan. That's usually attendant to have qualifying for present use value if your land is in forestry. And the 4th one, and I think this one's pretty critical, you're filing a Schedule F. That's the profit and loss addendum to your personal tax return, your 1040. And so if you have one of those 4 things, then you're automatically qualified as a bona fide farm and exempt from zoning. Right to farm, you might hear this come up sometimes, and I've seen this now lately in a few small farm settings. It's almost always having to do with livestock, but this is where your neighbor doesn't like that your goats are making a lot of noise, or that they're smelling, cow manure or whatever. There are times when neighbors are going to start complaining to the county, maybe Board of Health. They might complain to county animal control if your animals are getting out, which we'll talk about in the next slide. But generally, you're protected under North Carolina's right to farm law. And what that does is it just generally says that farms aren't a nuisance if they change. So if you're buying like raw land and you start upfitting it, developing it into a farm, it's going to be very difficult for your neighbor to suddenly start complaining that, hey, this is not what I want next to me, and they'll try to make complaints about your operation. Just know it's there if things really get tough. Finally, on this slide, while all of us, I think the 3 of us in this session here, are always advocating for a written lease of some sort whenever you're renting land. But there's times when you might find an entry point onto somebody else's land, and particularly if they're older, they might go, I just want to keep things the way they are, you can farm it. And they won't put their name to anything. Just know that tenancy is protected up through your harvest. And as a special bonus, if you in your verbal conversation with this landowner, say, hey, can I farm this for the year? Use those words, for the year, because what that does, if push ever came to shove and say that the land got sold and or the person you made the bargain with died, their heirs tried to move you off, or a new purchaser tried to move you off, just know that your tenancy is protected. And if you say, for the year, if they don't terminate, if the person who's promised you to be there does not terminate it before the end of the year within 30 days, and then you can roll over to the next crop year and be there for another year. So I've got, again, I don't know if I explained that very well, but I've written a bunch about it lately on that farm law website. Okay, next slide, please. A few more things. Get a lot of questions about our fence law. As such, North Carolina, believe it or not, was actually an open range state up until the early part of the 20th century. But we now have a requirement that all livestock must be fenced. It doesn't say, specifically, does it have to be a hot fence, barbed wire fence, whatever it happens to be. It just they have to be contained somehow. If you don't do that, and I don't imagine anybody ever would, I mean, this is valuable property, it's a class 3 misdemeanor. I mean, it's a very small thing, but you might find that if your livestock gets out, or and again, this applies to livestock, not to poultry, then your neighbor might make a call to the sheriff and say, hey, this is going on. This goes on anyways. I mean, neighbors, when they see loose livestock, I mean, they're concerned. They might call animal control. Just know that even though the fence law is not specific on what your containment method must be, if your livestock does get loose and causes an accident out on the road, and this is not uncommon, the question is going to arise, were you using reasonable efforts to contain your livestock? And then questions are going to come up about, how often do you count your livestock? Is your fence hot? Do you ever check the box to make sure that it's still hot? Are you using barbed wire? I think people have kind of moved away from barbed wire. But the question that's going to come up is, were you being reasonable in your containment method? And because a question of liability, if somebody gets hurt, them and their insurance company is going to want to find somebody to pay for the costs of this. Normally, your insurance company, and everybody should have a policy on their farm, will cover this sort of thing. You want to make sure that your insurance policy does. Do read the fine print. But that's generally how such matters would be handled. Although cases do move on to jury verdicts sometimes. I talked about nuisance law briefly in the last slide. Just know that this really does concern a neighbor starting to make complaint about your operation. They don't like the smell. I was dealing with a situation in Extension recently where a neighbor was really given a horse, somebody that had some horses, some real trouble based on the size of their manure pile, and claiming that waste was flowing onto their land. Generally, the neighbor's going to call out the soil and water conservationists to come look at it, things like that. But it's really just not be knowledgeable that if you're keeping a really sloppy show, yeah, it's possible somebody could claim you a nuisance and maybe get an injunction and get a court to stop your operation. I see a question here about voluntary ag districts. So the voluntary ag district is a voluntary program that the General Assembly passed, decades ago. It got revitalized in the past, 20 years or so. And 91 counties, I think Hoke County just passed theirs, 91 out of 100 counties have this type of ordinance. And it's really somewhat of an affinity program where you get a sign, it goes out on the highways as drivers see it, they're entering a voluntary ag district. There's a couple of other little benefits like waiver of sewer assessments if you happen to be farming where there's a sewer and water going past your farm, and normally landowners are required to pay an assessment and hook up to it, whether or not they hook up to it. But just the question here is, how does this relate to nuisance and right to farm? So after the whole right to farm law has been continually updated as nuisance lawsuits have happened, and particularly against the swine industry, not pasture pork, but the larger integrated system. And it resulted in some lawsuits and some big jury verdicts a couple of years ago against Murphy Brown / Smithfield. And the General Assembly in the voluntary ag district law, it used to be that if you signed up as a voluntary ag district, the GIS department, may or may not, depending on whether the county wanted to do it, put kind of a bubble around your land. So if somebody's searching, they're thinking about buying neighboring properties, it's sort of a way of warning people that they're coming next to a farm, so don't complain. It's going to be harder to complain. We don't know if that, but the counties after these lawsuits are now required to do that. And so, whether a title searcher sees it or not and warns their client that that they're moving next to a farm, I don't know for sure that connection is actually made, but no one is ultimately liable for not disclosing that. So it's just there. There's a colleague of mine over at Farm Bureau says it's somewhat measured by things that we never could know. Like, did the would-be landowner look at purchasing this farm and then decide not to because they saw the voluntary ag district bubble? We have no idea. There's no way of knowing that. And so it's somewhat hard to measure, but it hasn't been tested in court yet, to my knowledge. And so that's where that law is. Just know that some counties do have this enhancement to their voluntary ag district called an enhanced voluntary ag district. Just know that's not revocable. It's a 10-year agreement. And if you don't terminate it, but within I don't know what the exact time period is before the 10-year gig is up, it renews automatically for another 3 years. Just know that you're sort of gratuitously binding yourself into something that you can't get out of if for some reason you need to. And it's like if someone came along and made a really, really good offer, let's say on your land for like a solar facility or something like that. I know that is somewhat controversial in agriculture, but nonetheless, it pays big money. And I think if you were in an enhanced voluntary ag district, you're not going to be able to get out of it for that reason, and you don't get compensation for it. So I sound like I'm being negative on it. Some landowners are just like, nope, I want to put this land on ice for now, and they certainly do so. But anyways, a couple of land use topics to chew on. Again, I have more extensive information on these topics at the Farm Law web portal, so do check that out. Next is going to be Annette Hiatt from Land Loss Prevention Project. And Annette and I have worked together for a number of years on programs, and I'm glad that we're doing this together with Jamey and Annette. Anything more you want to say in an introduction?
Hey, good morning. Thank y'all for being here. Thank you, Andrew, for starting us off on the right foot on a Saturday morning. It's really, hopefully, exciting stuff. We all could talk about all these topics, and our whole intention was to kind of give an overview of some of the things that we see in our work with farms and across North Carolina. My organization is a Land Loss Prevention Project, and we are a nonprofit law firm based out of Durham, but we cover the whole state. We give legal assistance at no cost to landowners that are working to keep their property. And so one of the things that I wanted to highlight real briefly is kind of what does it mean when you talk about a farm transfer? Often we think about farm transfers as one thing, which is a sale of the property. But we're going to talk about it a little bit in a broader sense this morning, just because farm transfers take all shapes and sizes. And they're important to kind of consider the scope, the breadth of them, because as everybody hears over and over, our farm population, our farmers in North Carolina are aging. Average age in 2017 census was 58. But at the same time, we're having increases across the board, and we have a majority of small farmers. So we need to think creatively about what transfers actually mean. So it could be a sale. It could, though, be a lease or a combination of things. Transfers include things like purchase contracts, where you're considering the sale of land, business, equipment, even intellectual property. Farm transfers can also mean inheritance. So when someone passes away and leaves their property either through a will or not, how you come into the land. Landowners should always consider their ability to customize the transfer. So make it work for you in your unique circumstance. That could be the type of transfer, the process that you use, and what is included. If it touches land, you really need it to be in writing. Any lease over 3 years needs to be written and recorded, and any transfer of property, if you're giving or selling a portion of your land, needs to be written and recorded with the Registry of Deeds office. Estate planning is a different type of farm transfer, and it would involve who you would like to leave your property to after your death. Now, there can be some forms of estate planning that take place during your life, so that's why it's important to consider the full scope of what you want, and have those conversations with your family. Okay. So when you're thinking about the kind of transfer that you want to have, consider, what does that mean to you? Is it all or just a piece of your land? Does that include equipment? Does that include buildings? Are there things that can stay there? Or are there things that can be taken off? The business inclusions are things like intellectual property, which sounds like something that wouldn't apply to farming, but all of y'all are probably sophisticated enough to know that it does. It's your business name. It's your reputation in the community. It's trademarks that you use, even websites. And also you would include in a transfer leases. And any kind of transfer, you will have an impact on current lending situations. It will have an impact on taxes, whether that means federal taxes when you sell property, or whether it means what Andrew already covered, which is the present use valuation. A lot of people think, well, and Andrew covered really nicely, the change that would happen if someone doesn't re-enroll in the present use value program after they acquire property. But we also have to remember, when we're looking at how we want to transfer property, is that the present use value deferral will end even if there's a transfer through intestate or inheritance. So anytime that a deed changes, whether it's one person or all owners, the present use value deferral can be ended. So that's a really important thing to consider, even when you're drafting and planning for estate planning purposes. And I think I would really like us to have time to go through our examples that we're going to go to after Jamey speaks. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to Jamey. She's an attorney with Brooks Pierce, and she focuses on business and a whole wide range of business planning services. And she's going to talk to us about how best to protect our assets.
Thanks, Annette. And hello, everyone. Thanks again for joining us. When we think about asset protection, we want to think about managing risk, managing debt, and planning for the future. So a couple different areas on that. In terms of your farming entities, it's worthwhile to think about, and perhaps you are already doing this, but separating the real property from your business activities. If at all possible, we'd want the real property to not be vulnerable if something goes wrong with the business. There's different ways to do that. You can set it up in an LLC, or perhaps it's just owned by the family, but separating that out is maybe a worthwhile consideration. You also want to think about managing different businesses based on their risks. So agritourism can have risks that are different than, say, your goat farming. And it may be worthwhile to separate those out in terms of the entity and the books and the accounting, just again, to not associate the risk that you're taking on with your agritourism activities with your underlying goat farming operation. That said, those come with costs as well, right? Those different accounts, those different books. So you'll want to think about the trade-offs in that setup. Another way to manage risk, right, is insurance. Everyone should have a general umbrella insurance policy. Remember that insurance is a contract of obligations. So it's only going to cover what has been contracted for. So you want to know quite clearly what all it is you're doing, and you want to make sure your insurance carrier knows what all it is you're doing. You want to make sure that the animal getting into the road, or the things that are at risk of causing great cost, are going to be covered by that policy. crop insurance. Another area to make sure that you have that is state and crop specific. And so with crop insurance comes all kinds of deadlines that you're going to want to make sure that you make. You can access the USDA to know what kind of crop insurance is available or what kind of agents are available for crop insurance in your state. Again, contract of obligation. So you're going to want to make sure you are quite clear on, for instance, the sales closing date. So that's the latest that you can sign up for insurance for that next year. The final planting date. If you don't get your crop in on time and there's a disaster later in the year, that would undermine your ability to collect on that under that insurance agreement. Acreage reporting date. There are so many places along the ways that it's key, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in one of our scenarios to make sure that you're following your obligations in order to receive some sort of payout. There's a new insurance program that USDA is offering to small growers. It's called the Micro Farm Crop Insurance Program. So this is allowable for farms that are grossing about 100,000 on average. There's some circumstances in which it can go up to 125,000. The idea with this micro farm policy is that it's intended to be more accessible and less expensive. There's less reporting requirements, and there's no additional expenses involved in taking on this particular insurance. So I think that is new for this next 2022 period and something to look into. It's intended to support this community of small growers. Okay, so also thinking about managing risk in the area of family entities. And so I like to think about, right, we have business entities and then we have our family structures. How is it, if you are a farmer, that you want your farm to pass on to your family? And this is where estate planning really comes into key. I think we're all quite aware of the downsides of not doing estate planning up front and having those conversations with yourself and with your family about how the assets should be distributed. This can be particularly helpful if you engage in it early. Individual wills and also revocable trusts allow for you to serve as a trustee over your assets, but to have clearly planned out in a less onerous and expensive method how the distribution is going to be made after your death. Similarly, we want to think about what kind of resources are out there in the event that the unexpected occurs. And one of those programs, the Pandemic Response and Safety Grant Program, is again targeted to the small farm, sustainable farm community. The deadline for this particular grant program is November 22nd. And so if you've been thinking about applying, please go ahead and get on this. It covers any kind of COVID expenses that were taken on by the farm business or the nonprofit for COVID response, for COVID training, for protective gear. The smallest, I think, allocation is going to be $1,500, and the largest, I think, is it 22,000? 20,000. And there's no cost sharing, and there's no matching fund requirement. You will need to have a DUNS number to make the application. So if you're not established in the USDA grant making system, go ahead and look into this. But this could be a very helpful program for any of those expenses that folks maybe took on in the last couple of years. All right, so asset protection in the realm of debt. I think that whenever I say the word budget, folks maybe recoil a little. I'm a nerd. I love numbers. I love Excel spreadsheets. And so anything you can do to love organizing your budget, the better. Those records are going to be important for anything that comes down the road. And the more that you can get quite clear on your cash flow and the ways in which you are managing what's coming in and what's coming out, all the better. If at all possible, please avoid paying business expenses on any kind of personal credit. If you do end up in a tight space, don't forget that there may be opportunities to work out some sort of restructuring with your lenders before you're facing foreclosure or before you're considering bankruptcy. Bankruptcy, foreclosure, all the kinds of things that take place if creditors need to regain whatever value is left are expensive and time consuming. And it could be to everyone's benefit to work out another approach. And then there's bankruptcy. And this is one of my specialty areas. It's intended to be a pause for debtors that are overwhelmed by creditors asking for payment on things they can't make. So it stops everything. If it's going to be helpful, it's going to be helpful early. It's the kind of thing that if you're going to file for bankruptcy, you want to file before foreclosure. That's how your property may be able to be saved. That's how value may be able to be maximized. That's how you may be able to protect your assets. So if you start to feel overwhelmed by debt, just like if we feel overwhelmed in other areas of our lives, the earlier we ask for help, the better. Bankruptcy, just as a quick overview, is a series of different chapters in the bankruptcy code. It's part of the US code. There are 3 primary chapters that are considered the reorganizing chapter. So this is for people or entities, businesses, nonprofits that have the capacity to stay afloat and regain their financial footing, but they need some help. So they have the capacity to make, say, payments over a longer period of time with some restructuring, versus if there are individuals or entities that just are so overwhelmed and cannot reorganize or are ready to shut their doors, liquidating it. That's chapter 7 is the route that is often considered. Bankruptcy can be especially valuable if, and these are primarily in the reorganizing chapters, but if you have debts that are greater than the value of the asset, bankruptcy allows you to write down the debt to the actual value. So you wouldn't have to pay more than the asset is actually worth in the market. Chapter 12, which was designed specifically for family farmers, even allows you to write down your mortgage. So if your debt has exceeded the value of your house, you could bring that down and then spread those payments out over time and keep your house and keep your farm. Bankruptcy could also potentially be valuable for if you have real property that is unencumbered by debt, or if you have real property with equity in it. Again, this is Chapter 12 specific, but if you sell real property through the Chapter 12 process, you can avoid having to pay those capital gains taxes, which would be another form of protecting your assets, right? That's a lower expense and you're maximizing what value you do have. And last, under any of the reorganizing chapters, you are able to extend repayment over a longer period of time. Pre-COVID, most of the chapters had plans that were 3 to 5 years, although Chapter 12 allows for much longer for family farms. I think since the COVID policies have been enacted, one of the impacts to bankruptcy is that in chapters 11 and 13, you can also extend those over longer periods of time. Chapter 13 is typically the chapter that individuals with personal debt use to reorganize their financial circumstances. And Chapter 11 tends to be for much larger reorganizations, although a new subchapter 5 for small businesses is available and designed to be accessible for smaller entities. It's faster and there's less reporting requirements. There are, of course, downsides to bankruptcy. It's unfortunate, but there's a stigma to it, and I hope we can start to see it as part of the safety net. It's essential and helpful and can be really meaningful if it's the right choice. But it is expensive and it is time and energy consuming. For instance, if you engage in a Chapter 12, at any point that you want to take on debt over the course of your plan, you have to go to the court and ask permission. You have to file sometimes monthly or quarterly reports, and you have to make regular payments into the Chapter 12 estate or to the trustee in order to keep the process going and retain your property. So trade-offs, but something to consider. And again, if this is something you think you may want to be considering, talk to me, talk to Andrew, talk to Annette. If we can't help you, we'll put you in touch with somebody that can, but thinking about your options early is better. All right. I cannot actually see anything but our slides because of the system we're using. So we would love to take questions at this time, if folks have questions, and I'm going to rely on my colleagues to let us know if there are questions.
Not yet.
Okay. All right. Let's go into some scenarios. Okay, so again, these are situations that we've seen come up in our work, and we'd like to talk everybody through some things we think folks should keep in mind. Again, if this triggers any questions, please put them into the chat and we'll address them as we go. All right, so young farmer Andy is trying to get into farming, but Andy can't afford to purchase land right now. So Andy is connected with another farmer, Farmer Bet, and Bet is considering her options for her farm business. Bet's elder and Bet's children aren't into farming and they don't live anywhere nearby. But Bet, quote, wants to keep the business active in case the children change their minds. So what are the things that Andy and Bet need to keep in mind as they approach whether or not this may be a good fit? Andrew, Annette.
Well, I took my mute off. Scotty and Don, I was trying to answer your question. My apologies. We'll get back to it. So yeah, this scenario, if I can jump in here, I would say that this is not uncommon. We've gone through somewhat of a generational change of land. I would say, 10, 15 years ago, I mean, particularly as, Annette and I were earlier in our careers and working with landowners, we were seeing a lot of folks in the World War II generation still, or even older, still owning farms. And a lot of this land is transitioned over now, or, is passed down now to their children who are largely baby boomers or in their 60s, even 70s. And so, we sort of refer to them as the children. And when I see this scenario here, I see, Bet, don't quite know how old she is, but obviously her kids are grown and they're somewhere else. They're not working on the farm. They're not participating in the production on the land. And so my view on this sort of scenario, again, which is not uncommon at all, is that, Bet would like to find somebody to come in and help maintain this thing. When I see the words, wants to keep the business active in case they change their minds, what jumps out there is that's really saying that, Andy's sort of a placeholder as a younger person and able to do this labor to keep this operation going, whatever his, tasks are going to be. But if one of the kids, their life circumstances changed, or they decided to come back to start caring for Bet if she got older, then, Andy might be in a precarious position if he doesn't try as best as possible to get an agreement early on with Bet to really get some equity stake in these assets and this business that they're running.
So it sounds like Andy, from Andy's perspective, Andy needs to be quite clear on what it is Andy wants out of this. I think when we were preparing for this, if Andy is interested in just getting some farm experience, this could be a good fit. But if Andy is thinking more about a long-term path and wants to build some wealth or wants to have land of his own, a farm of his own, this may not be the best fit.
Right. And when you're thinking about Bet, from Bet's perspective, her concern is, how do I pass on wealth to the next generation? So how do I have this asset? How do I protect it? How do I make it profitable during this time, even if I'm not the one doing it, before I pass it on to my children or to my grandchildren? And so I think having that conversation early on about clarifying both of their goals and how do they match up. Sometimes they can. Andy might only be looking for experience, and so that Andy can go on and have the experience to start farming on a different piece of property. But if Andy is looking more for, I want this as a path to purchase, it may not line up and it may not match. So they really have to talk and kind of work together to see how they match up. And Bet has to talk to her children to see, are they really going to come back? Because sometimes when you have those conversations, the children will say, yeah, I have my own home. My family is here and I don't have plans to come back home to the farm. And those are important because that helps Bet to plan longer term. And so I think we talked a little bit when we were preparing this too about employment. So, just going and starting to work do you need to really start thinking about employment contracts? Is it a lease? Is it, just a job? Or are you really kind of working into, am I going to, in the future, purchase this property? And so I guess my question back to you guys is, if Andy says, oh, well, Bet doesn't really want me to buy this property from her, should Andy be thinking about an employment contract?
Yeah, I mean, I think Andy wants to ask himself, what's it worth to be involved in this role without the opportunity to buy the land? So if Andy's willing to serve as a farm manager for however many years, at what price is that worth it to him, such that maybe he's saving for farm somewhere to purchase land somewhere else? There's also the opportunity to do, a trial run for a year and see how both parties feel at the end. It may be that this is a good engagement for a couple years while Bet sorts things out with her family and gets quite clear on her own estate planning. There's lots of different ways and different contracts that could be used to sort out how this could play out if it's a good fit. But you're right. Starting with everyone being quite clear on what they want is important, and get it in writing. Writing is important because it's so often that people think they have the same thing in mind, and then the words on the paper make it a bit different. And that's what's going to be able to stand up if there is a disagreement down the road.
I want to add a couple of thoughts. And yeah, we did talk about this yesterday. The two conversations, or one conversation that Annette, alluded to this, is Bet, talking to her children. I mean, and the thing is there's a lot of, a mentor of mine once said that you can't paper over people. And people can come to written agreements and all that, but written agreements are only as good as one's willingness and financial ability to enforce it in court. And so, Andy's really got to make sure that Bet has this conversation with her children. And I would say gets a little bit of maybe a wake up call, because that could be there. Because a lot of times, sometimes parents are really surprised to find out their kids don't want to have anything to do with this land. Hey, they'd love to have the money. That's always going to be there. They'd love to have its value, but coming back and managing land is just not in a lot of people's plans. And so I think that'll earlier on we'll get Bet thinking more in the direction of, well, what's this going to do? And what I would caution Andy on is, as Jamey just said, I know that a lot of informal agreements start informally, verbally, and that's really kind of just the way of the world. As best as possible, even if it's on a napkin, just something to say, hey, we're going to do this. This is what the tasks are going to be. This is what our relationship's going to be for the year, but we're going to meet quarterly and kind of discuss the future. And I would always be cautioning Andy, don't go too far down the road, because when you're young, you don't realize you're not seeing what life looks like when you're 50 or in your 40s, and things change before you know it. And so I throw that out there because, sometimes folks do carry on for a good while on a hope and a promise without getting good, agreements in place that lead to equity. So.
Do we have any questions, or should I keep us going?
I think we actually have some really interesting questions in chat. So if you guys have anything to conclude on these,
anybody got any questions or any thoughts on this scenario?
Yeah. Most of the things that I'm seeing have to do with a slightly different question.
Okay. Well, I think we address them while they're fresh. And if I need to go back a slide, let me know.
Yeah. I think at this point, it's not going to be on our slides, because it's really about LLC and corporate ownership.
Okay.
So there's several questions in here related to ownership of an LLC. So let's see. There's a question that asks about land, and the person April says, my land is in my name, but my farm is an LLC for operation and sales. How to rent the land to the LLC? I think that's a a less complicated question maybe than the next one. So if we could start there and kind of introduce LLCs and corporations,
Sure.
and we can go to the next question.
Okay, I'm gonna take down the slides for right now.
They're down on our screen.
Oh, good to know. All right. Okay, so April, good question. So it's like any other lease, right? You're going to lease the land to the business. You're going to want to have a lease agreement. You're going to want to think about what is the appropriate price for that rental. And you're going to want to have that all out in paper and in writing. It's not actually a super complicated process, except for that you're going to want to think about the tax implications on both sides. And so going through all those steps, that's where an attorney could help you with that. But I think it absolutely makes sense. And it's something that we encourage our clients to do, to line those out and think about that as a traditional lease agreement between one entity and another, or in your case, it'd be between you and your farm business.
Hey, what I would add to that is yeah, this is a traditional arrangement. And again, the reason you organize your working assets, your income earning assets into an LLC is to separate them from your capital assets, your land. And if push came to shove, it's not often that people are able to do what we call pierce the corporate veil and get rid of the liability protection of an LLC and go after the personal assets, particularly the land. It's good to have that written lease in place to show that this is somewhat of an arm's length agreement, that, it's like, look, and you're making sure that you're paying rent on a monthly basis, or whatever the agreement says. It could be an annual payment. Actually, mostly often is an annual payment. But make sure that happens before December 23rd, that money changes accounts. It goes from your LLC account into your personal banking account, and it shows up in your QuickBooks or whatever, software you're using. But the lease also can be very useful in the sense that you can cost allocate, so to speak. You do what's called a triple net lease. You require the entity, the LLC, the tenant on your land, to pay the property tax bill. They make the lease payments, but also to pay any insurance that you're carrying, that you might personally be carrying on the land. Require in addition to the rent and the property taxes, require the LLC to pay that. So that's coming out of the LLC's account as an operating expense. And that's done really, that's kind of the common arrangement in this. And I would just add, I'll stop there. So.
There's a ton of questions in this realm. So I'm going to try and scroll back up. All right. On the land trust question, that's a complicated question. A land trust, as I understand it, and I don't have as much familiarity with this as maybe Annette or Andrew do, but I would not think about it as an estate planning program. I would think about it as a way to protect land to be used in a certain way and to reduce the expense of maintaining that land. If you are sure that's what you want to do, then I would think about the possibility of engaging in a land trust. But it's as an estate planning mechanism, it just means that if your children or your heirs or whoever you pass the property to are going to be encumbered by that decision, right? So that land trust continues with the land and cannot be altered by some later generation, theoretically.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah. And I was thinking about trust. Trust is kind of a phrase that gets used a lot. So there are land trust organizations, there are entities that will put a conservation easement on property. So for example, there's the Black Family Land Trust that focuses on agricultural land and the African American community specifically, and forest land. There's also traditional conservation easement programs that you might hear about that will acquire property, whether it's for cultural, historical, or conservation purposes. And there's an easement that's put on it that prevents development. There's also a trust mechanism, which is something you can start yourself. And they're kind of different. The question that I'm reading, it sounds a little bit like, how do I protect so that there's not a bunch of development around? And so that is one technique that you could use, is using a conservation easement to protect the property from further development, kind of like what Jamey's been saying. And I think there's there's several mechanisms to be able to do that.
Right, I'm going to keep going down. April's asking, I'm funding my farm with my personal savings since the farm is new and not making enough to cover startup costs. Is there a way to not make this over confusing to pay myself back one day? So I'd say two things. Get familiar with an Excel spreadsheet, or however records you want to keep for what all you're funding and from where. It doesn't need to be overly confusing, but it does need to be documented in order for you to be able to be paid back in a way. And this is more of a question for a financial planner, I think, than it would be for an attorney. But it may be worthwhile to set up like a separate account and think through who's paying who for what, and be consistent in that and have records around that. Do you guys have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would say and this doesn't come out in the question, whether you're farming, your own land or whether you're farming. Oh wait, yeah, you do. You do own your own land. When I see the word farm, I think of income. I mean, money in, money out in terms of an operating business. And so, what you're really asking there is, how long do I wait, but for profitability? And because yes, in your personal savings, that's just your startup capital. It's like you either get it from a bank or your own, wherever you have it, parents, whatever. But I think what the question is you're going to put money in until money starts coming out in a profitable manner. And the question becomes, how long do you do that? I mean, so long as you're able to continue to cover your if you own the land outright, you don't have debt on it, then that's covering the property taxes is sufficient. But it's somewhat inconsequential if you have a loan on it, where the money comes from to make those make the mortgage payments on the land. So that I may not be answering the question very well, but I mean that's what I look at it. I mean you're just describing your startup costs, and it's really a question about how long do you go before you're actually earning a profit.
On the question of LLC versus S corporation, so Scotty, I saw your earlier, Scotty and Donna, I saw your earlier explanation, and this sounds like a very good fit. I'm not as familiar with S corps. I think they could be a very good fit in the right situation, but I cannot speak to that personally. Annette or Andrew, do you all?
I'll jump in quickly. And this is just my own experience. I mean, I think this is always a kind of a challenging question that takes so many, additional, sometimes tax issues that are very specific to the facts of that particular situation. My experience, LLC. I usually had a joke that if I came, to a client that already had a corporation formed, it was usually formed by an older attorney in a rural area, and because LLCs are relatively new. I mean, I say relative, 30, 40 years old. Corporate forms,
they're
hundreds
simpler.
Of years old.
Yeah.
And so by and large, the LLC has taken the place of the corporation in this setting, and it's just so much easier in my opinion, to form and to manage. So,
but there are, as Andrew said, there are situations, and they're tax specific, that it could be a good fit, and that could be a tax attorney, or that could be a financial planner.
Right, and I think there's different reporting guidelines, and those are all really important questions that you're asking. I saw another question that had to do with ownership of assets. And I think that's something that's really important to consider when you're forming a business entity like an LLC or a corporation, is to remember to move title of the assets. So just because you form an entity doesn't mean that it owns legal title. So sometimes you have to consider whether or not you want to transfer ownership of land, transfer asset of equipment or cars or vehicles into the ownership of the entity. Because if I form Hiatt Enterprises, but my house is still titled or my car is still in my personal name, it's not going to be a corporate asset. And so it's not going to be protected by that shield that I wanted to create with the LLC or the corporation.
And that actually transitions us some into Clement's question. So Clement, I hear that you have hardly any, well, congrats first. It sounds like you are doing great things. So good job. I hear you that you don't have any equity in the property at this point. So there's not a lot of value necessarily that is vulnerable. But the situation that comes to mind for me is, let's say that you are unfortunately in a car accident of some kind and you injure somebody else and your car insurance doesn't cover their injuries. I'm an attorney, so I'm doing worst case, and I'm sorry for that. If for whatever reason the other party wanted to sue you personally and come after you for your assets, they could reach the land, and the judgment could be attached to the land, and the land could ultimately be sold to pay for whatever is owed. So the equity question is part of it, but another piece of that question is, how important is it to you that the land be tied to you personally versus protected by a corporate shield where your business assets can't be reached by personal actions? I hope that answers that question. Okay, Laura is asking about rent to own or lease to own options. Laura would like to invest in the land, have someone build, manage a farm, but also create an opportunity for them to build wealth, while Laura also benefiting from the capital gains and farm income along the way. So Laura, sounds like a dream scenario. Me too. And I think the thing that, there's a couple questions that arise. Do you have off-farm income? And how much can the farm earn on its own that would be available to both pay the person that you're hiring, as it sounds like, a farm manager, so that they can build wealth, and you also benefit from the land and the reduced costs. That's where my mind goes. What is it you're doing on the land, and is there enough of a profit that's taking place that you can benefit and also pay this farm manager enough that they can build wealth? Andrew, Annette, anything to add?
I think, again, lease to own is fairly common. You just have to make sure that you come to the arrangement of how you're, what portion of the rent's going to be put to, potentially the purchase price. It doesn't have to be that. Really, the most important part of that arrangement to me is the option.
Yeah.
Because that's what locks it in place. Because you're going to have to, you're probably not going to build up enough money to purchase the land just by, the landowner portioning some rent to it. But the important thing is that if the landowner decides to sell the farm, you got to have that option in there. And take it a step further, that has to be recorded, or a memo of it has to be recorded in the chain of title. So that's probably the most important thing about that question, is just make sure that you have a legal foot in the door. And if you do, go out and get the loan if something happens. But you might not earn enough money to do that. I'm going to jump in on the last question here, Laura, because I know Roland's coming back. In my view, with conservation easements, conservation easements as a concept are indifferent to who owns the land. It's a landowner's decision to enter into that agreement. If they want compensation, that's harder because it's a very, very competitive program now. It used to be that land trusts and funders were sort of like trying to really get farmers interested in this. Well, they're interested. Yeah. And so it's now not just a matter, and this kind of goes back to the land trust usage of Donna's question. It's not just a matter of, I want to do this. It's a competitive program, even if you want to donate it. There's just not people lined up out there just to take on the responsibility. But in direct answer to the question, helping with land loss and land affordability, yeah, maybe. It's a maybe question. Just depends on where the land is, because just because you have a conservation easement on it doesn't necessarily mean it's locked in at a lower price. The price is always going to be the seller's option at how much they can get in the market. And so it strips it away from MI Homes or some big, residential developer, but it doesn't always, just because it's conservation easement, bring it down to the level of what we might consider to be affordability.
Well, and it's also, go ahead.
Well, I was just going to say really, really quickly that I think there's a lot of potential but the funding for conservation land trusts to be able to come in and purchase that property, which is often what farmers need. But the reality is that they need to be paid for the property, or could be. It's not there, and they don't take large pieces or smaller pieces of property because the administrative cost is very difficult. So there's a need there for increased funding for conservation programs that allow land to stay in active farming that can then be leased to smaller farmers or open that door for lots of people to be able to use it. And that's really what I wanted to add to that.
The last thing I would add, so the IRS is also paying much closer attention to some of these activities in the larger realm. And so if it's something you're considering, you want to make sure that you have a reputable land trust that you're working with and a reliable land appraiser to not involve yourself in some other wild amount of litigation. Laura, I'm sorry. You're right. You were the person that owned the land, and you are thinking of a lease to sell, essentially. And so you can structure that however you want. I think it's sort of similar to the other scenario we had. Just ask yourself, when would I be willing to let go of this, and what is the value, and how am I going to backtrack that out over a yearly period of time for an appropriate rental payment? How is that going to apply? How are the expenses going to be discounted? An attorney could help you with that. A financial planner could help you with that too. Clement, when would it make sense to put the property under the LLC? I think as soon as you have time. We can put you in touch with somebody. You can reach out to one of us, but that's actually something you could do on your own, or an attorney could walk you through the process.
And I think Scotty and Donna, the question about putting personal assets into the LLC, you're on the right track, because the idea is to separate.
Mhm.
So personal assets you would want to keep out.
Yeah, I'm sorry if that was confusing. That might have been me.
Yeah, go back to whoever's question was about leasing, forming the LLC and leasing the land to it, your own land. That's the model.
Land boundary questions. That's probably an Andrew question. Oh, that's an Annette question. Great. Yes, you can reach out to Annette about land boundary. Oh, or Andrew. In what circumstances? Clement, it's something that I would encourage you to just do when you have time and the capacity to think about it. I think there's a fee for filing, and there will be expenses in terms of setting yourself up to manage the business separate. But I think it's worthwhile to just do.
And you can talk to us too. I think we're going to have our contact information, so we're happy to talk.
Oh, yeah. Sorry, I had that slide. I'll end us on that. Contact us. And thank you all for your time. I'm sorry it was a roll through all those questions so quickly. It's so great to see so much interest.
Roland, you're on mute.
Jamey, Annette, Andrew, you guys have done a great job. Thank you so much for this informative session. And thank you for sharing your contact info. This recording will continue to be available, so you can, you all as our attendees can see this material and follow up with this contact information. And also feel free to stop by Land Losses booth during the trade show, as they're glad to answer your questions there as well. Thank you all so much for taking this time. We really appreciate it, and we hope you have a great rest of the conference. And thanks again to our panelists. Have a great day.
Bye, guys.
Adios.
Thank y'all.